recording. Okay, so let's start by going through the homework, if that works for everyone, and then we'll get back to the guest. So, and I'll take questions in the meantime too. So if we don't end up getting to the homework before the guest, that's okay. Regex says, Doubt 1, get restaurants. All right, I can copy this so that we can all look at the same thing. Hold on one second. All right. Just getting all my chats and everything in the right place. Okay, so let's resume this so we can talk about this question. Okay, so the question is, you define two routes, one for a index route and one for a show route. And it says, I can go from main to child, which is fine, but I can also come from child to main. Why? I haven't specified as in the first get. It is because the get that you have there follows Rails's convention of resources. And when you do that, it automatically will define the as. So I can see how that would be confusing, but for the most part, you, I think, don't need to worry about that piece. So the idea is that here, in here, we didn't specify an as, and you still can do like link to restaurants, even though we didn't write as here. So it's just where I was trying to help you. I wouldn't depend on it. I would go put the route there and write the as. Or even better yet, use resources like we covered yesterday. Johnny says, I understand where dot first. So where of something dot first will grab the first name. Find by, how will it know which number to take? Yeah, so I can show that. If I go into a controller, just so I get the kind of right thing. So if I do car.where make is Lincoln, this is going to return an array-like object. If I do car.find by make Lincoln, this is always going to return a single object of the type car. So I hope that answers your question, Johnny. Find by will always return a single item. So it's not about how does it determine whether or not to return a single item. It will always return a single item. So it is essentially the same thing as writing where make Lincoln dot first. So find by is just where dot first. Okay. Andrew says, yesterday when you created the instrument and then created the resource, the show method in the controller where you saved instrument has params, but we haven't specified this params anywhere. Is this something that the resource makes automatically? I do not have my controller here, unfortunately, because I think I maybe didn't save it. Didn't save it yesterday because it's on it's on this computer. Okay, so you pasted it. So the show endpoint looked a little bit like this. And we have params of ID. So you get the params of ID for free using the resources. Because remember, when you use resources instruments, one of the things that it defines is get instruments slash like this. So because of the way that this defines, you see that the named parameter is always called ID. So I hope that helps. The name parameter using resources will always be called ID, like this. Anonymous attendee says, sorry, I'm a little bit behind. I don't have any subfolders in the views. Can you tell me why? You should have subfolders in the views if you use the Rails generate controller to create your controllers. So if you look back on previous examples, or sorry, previous sessions, that should help you a bit. But the idea basically is when you're creating a new controller, you want to use Rails generate controller and then the name of the controller. And when you do that, let's see what it's going to do. It's going to just wait a second. It's going to create a controller file. It's going to create the views subdirectory. So that's where you'll put the individual views. So your code space doesn't load. I think some people have had to essentially delete the code space and recreate it. In that case, you'll have to reinstall Rails, but all of your files that you've saved should still be there. And I think that some people dropped instructions on how to do that in the Slack chat. Okay. So this is the homework. So the first question is, if you didn't do session 8, render your message list. If you didn't on session 8, render your message list using a view and HTML. So let's take a look at ours and see if we did that. And we did. So remember, we have messages equals chat.messages here. And then in our view folder, we have this index endpoint that shows the messages. So we can verify that that's working correctly by just doing Rails server. And we'll click open in browser. Okay, so we got some pending migrations because I was working, remember yesterday I was working on the other computer, so these just haven't been run here yet. I'm gonna run them, I'm gonna start the server, I'm gonna refresh. And then remember it's at chats, chats slash what was my chat named? Does anyone remember? Let's look, chat dot first dot name. I got no chats. We'll do, so that was on the other computer, I guess. We'll do create the chat called books. I appreciate everyone. We'll run the server again. So now we should be able to go to /chats/books. And we just see hello world because there are no messages yet. So we're going to go in here and I will do a split pane and we'll do Rails console. I will get the first chat and then I will create a messages body hello world. And then we'll do some other with a space maybe. We'll refresh that. Now you can see the two messages there. And also remember yesterday we learned a bunch of HTML, so we can use that here. We're going to create a header, and then for each message, we'll wrap it in a div tag. So let's refresh again. Now you see my multiple messages. Okay. And if you want that thing to go away, I think it's, oh, I did it wrong. I don't know how to do it. But here are the messages being displayed. So that's exercise 1. Is there any questions on exercise 1 before I keep going? So the first part of exercise 1, I think a lot of you had did this, the previous homework. So exercise 1 is just to take the data, pass it via an instance variable from the controller over into the corresponding view. So we defined @messages, which is equal to the chat's messages. And then in the view, we can access that. And we can actually prove that that's the case. Maybe we'll just use @chat as well. So now we're making chat available inside the view as well. Okay. So then if we go over to the view, we can write something like you are in the chat for chat.name. Save that, refresh. And then someone saying it's like that. Thank you. Okay, so you're in the chat for books. Now we're going to go to exercise 2. Exercise 2 is to put the messages on different lines using divs. Okay, well, I just did that. And if I want to space them out a little bit, I can use a div. And I can also include a break tag. So if I refresh, let's put another break tag. You can see that now they're spaced out a little bit. Okay. And our panelists just joined, which is great. But I'm going, hello. I'm going to just finish one thing and then we'll get started here. Actually, I'm going to save this until afterward. So I'm going to stop screen sharing. We will go on to the next exercise right after our speaker, which is going to be awesome. Okay, I will find out how to do this. We're going to bring on Eddie. Okay, how's it going?
John,
Long time to see you, man.
It's been a couple of years, right? I probably saw you. We probably ran into each other at one of the IQ BBQs, I think.
Yep. I think that's right. Or maybe like one day randomly around the office.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So by way of introduction, Eddie is the head recruiter at Genius, which is formerly Rap Genius. It's a company based in Brooklyn, and you can find the website at genius.com. I used to work at Genius in the same space as Eddie. And I think one thing that's really, and Eddie also used to work at General Assembly, which is a tech boot camp in New York City. And I think that one thing that's really, really great about Eddie, and I've always appreciated, is that a lot of recruiters are not very technical, but Eddie actually is. So Eddie has a background in tech. So he likes to take tech and mix it with recruiting. You take those two things together and you can make your job a lot easier, but you can also find better people, I think. So you've done a great job, I think, at Genius filling out the engineering team and just all the teams. I really appreciate you, and it's great to have you.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate you, man. Working at the same company with John, and it was like, you and really the core engineering team. You were super, welcoming when I joined, and it was a pleasure working with y'all. It's a lot of fun.
Thanks, man. So if you could spend a little bit of time, I think we have as long as you want, realistically, but like if you can spend like maybe 10 minutes giving like a background on yourself and kind of like how you got where you are. And then we'll have people kind of, as they're talking, just dropping questions in the Q&A, and you can answer whichever ones are appealing to you.
Definitely. Yeah. So I was super excited to hear that John was building this kind of free school thing. Of the same, like John mentioned, I used to work at General Assembly before Genius. So I joined General Assembly during the summer of 2012, back when they were only teaching coding. And I think that they launched they shortly after launched the UX immersive program, which looks like Sarah was a graduate from. What's up, Sarah? So what I did for General Assembly was I led their career services team and function for the New York City campus, which was the biggest one. General Assembly is just starting to expand to London and then other cities domestically and internationally. But I was basically tasked with creating programs that connected coding grads with companies around New York City. So it kind of, my first sort of foray into like the hiring world of New York, which eventually led me to recruiting, which I'll get into in a second. But working with fresh grads who were learning coding for the first time, I was deep into that world. So yeah, worked at GA. And then as John mentioned, I got a chance to, I'm not like a comp sci major or anything, but I really learned, General Assembly had a policy where employees, I don't think that they still have, employees could take courses for free. So there was no way that I wasn't going to just take all of the classes that I could. I first learned a little bit about product management, but then ended up getting into Rails. So everybody's like, oh, you got to get into Rails, you got to do Rails. This was like 2013 when Rails was the hottest thing out. So I learned coding there. And I got good enough on the side to where I was sort of co-instructing some introduction to Rails part-time courses at General Assembly. So I would, you never know something when you know something really well when you have to teach it to somebody. So that really kind of sharpened me up on coding, still working within the hiring space as well. So I was at General Assembly for 3 years, and the first recruiter that was hired at back when it was Rap Genius, his name is Matt Clark. I knew Matt because as a part of working for GA, I built up a huge network of employers. Matt Clark was at Warby Parker back in the day. We became friends, and then he moved over to Rap Genius. He was sort of the sole recruiter. And when I was figuring out what my next move was going to be after General Assembly, he was like, "Hey, why don't you come over here and help me out with growing all of our engineering team, but also some of the other roles that we have to hire at Genius." So it was a combination of like I knew engineering. I was technical, and I was going to blend that into actually being on the recruiting side of the hiring market. So I put all those things together and joined Genius to work with Matt and ultimately work with John and the rest of the engineering team, and specifically focus on technical recruiting, hiring for product managers, full stack engineers, mobile engineers, and even product designers. So I was just sort of heads down on that. That's how I got to know John and the rest of the team, and really kind of build up sort of my recruiting experience. And that was at the end of 2015. So fast forward to now, I've since stayed at Genius. It'll be 5.5 years now. Matt Clark, who brought me in, had moved on to do other things. And I got kind of just climbed the ranks, and am currently running recruiting at Genius still. And so not just hiring tech, but hiring across the board, sales, video production, integrated marketing, you name it. I've probably sourced and hired it before.
Even things like artist relations,
right?
Like,
Artist relations. Yeah, exactly. The job people were kicking the door down to get into Genius to do. Like one of the jobs people were excited about most.
Also, we had a journalism program for a bit. So you're.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, because John, you joined you joined after like the web annotator, like Annotate the World. You joined it right at that time, right?
Yeah.
So it was annotate all text on the internet, and that included journalism, and that included political speeches, and that included the Great Gatsby, the Chipotle menu. It was everything. So that's when we had it, right?
Yeah, that was wild.
It's crazy. It's a crazy times, man. Oh man, time flies.
So it looks like we have some questions starting to come in here. And thank you for the introduction. If anyone has questions for Eddie, you can ask questions about Genius, about recruiting, about basically anything, I think.
Yeah. So you all where are you? Where's everybody at in this program? Are you, I can obviously answer questions about what it is like to be a job seeker for an engineering role or technical role, when you're kind of when you're changing careers, so I can answer things from a recruiting standpoint of those things. But are people at that stage, or people still sort of getting into
we kind of have a
coding?
mix. We have some people that have coded before, some people that are going through the bootcamp and learning to code. We are about, I think we're 10 days now into 10 days of work, plus all the exercises and everything that come with that. Through the bootcamp, we've learned Ruby, we've learned Rails. So people here know how to create controllers, views, HTML files, the whole thing. So next we're getting into CSS and JavaScript, and then we're going to have a final project at the end. So it's been pretty wild.
Very dope. All right, so I could just sort of do these questions one by one. From Caitlin, I love that you're a recruiter with a tech background. Thank you so much. Wish there were more recruiters. A lot of recruiters are scared to death of tech. So, having that background was definitely really helpful. What can less experienced developers do to stand out when applying for junior roles? Um, well, there's a couple of ways to like get your foot in the door into the interview process, but also ways to stand out. Um, I mean, sh- showing interest in just like the community, somebody who's active in the community, whether it be like, it's always fun to see when candidates are, if pop onto their Twitter and they're like retweeting stuff from like RailsConf, or they're, retweeting technical talks and those kinds of things, and they're, they're active on it. It shows that a more sort of junior type person is really interested in learning, and has a huge affinity for growing. So, just showing interest in that on the internet, and creating a presence like that is really important. I mean, even just like blogging, like, oh, I decided to learn this new like library or something, and you're kind of like blogging your experience around how you're learning it. Like, those are things that can differentiate you a little bit. Shows they're almost like, how like if you were a writer, you would sort of show like a work sample or a writing sample. Like, your study shows like your thinking in approaching frameworks or libraries or technical problems. That is very supplementary to just like resumes and stuff like that. So you can create a bit of an internet presence in that way. Being active on GitHub. Like, if I hop into your GitHub and I'm looking at like some sort of some source repos rather than forked repos. If somebody's GitHub is just all forked repos, and they're just like, it's nice to see some original projects that you may be building out on your side or a part of this program. It's really good to see sort of original work that way, whether it be a Rails app or something else that you're trying, like a React thing or something. Being active on GitHub is really good, right? Because you see there's somebody's sort of profile page, and you can kind of see the calendar sort of boxes lighted up to see the activity, like, oh, these many days in a row of activity on GitHub. Like, those are really encouraging things to see for a potential employer on a junior candidate as well. So those are sort of good signals. But getting your foot in the door with an employer, I think most companies just have take-home assignments, right? Take-home assignments they're great for more sort of junior candidates because they're low cost to the company. Like, you don't need somebody. It's not a technical interview where John's jumping on a 1 hour Google Hangout or Zoom to do a technical thing. Take homes are really nice sort of asynchronous tests that are low cost to us, but give a chance for a junior engineer to really show that they have the ability to do it. Most companies do have it. So if you're talking to a company, you get a chance to chat with somebody, and they don't bring it up, just you should bring it up and say, hey, listen, if you're not interested in jumping on the phone with me as a junior candidate, do you have a take-home test? Send it to me. Give me a chance to prove it, and that's a great way to get your foot in the door. That's low cost to the company as well. So those are sort of some examples.
I really like what you're saying about when you're looking at a more junior developer, we don't need to see that they have experience, because obviously you're a junior developer, so you're not going to have all that experience. But we do need to see is that you have the interest to gain the experience that you don't have. So a lot of like what you're saying with like a Twitter presence or a GitHub, a couple GitHub repositories, they don't need to be like great projects, but they need to be there because it shows that you like are interested in exploring. Like, that's the
Yeah,
person we want to hire. We want to hire someone that wants to explore, wants to grow.
exactly. And get well versed in something enough to where you have like an opinion on it. When if I get on a phone call with a junior engineer and I'm like, oh, what kind of stack do you like? Which frameworks do you like to work with? And somebody that's like, oh, I use this, I use that. Why do you like working with these? Which one do you like more? Somebody that has some sort of done some kind of comparison. Well, I like this framework over that one because of this one's more performant, or this one is really good for like e-commerce or something. Like, having an opinion about tech is really, it shows that you're like a discerning, inquisitive engineer. Like, those are great signals. Um, okay, how can one leverage their prior experience to a first-time developer role? Right. So like, how can you leverage non-tech experience into a technical role? The sort of classic conundrum. I would say it's tough to do, right? Because, well, if you're looking for an entry level role, like John said, we don't necessarily expect a person to have, experience. If somebody's making a career change, there are always like parallels between roles. Like for example, a project manager maybe in construction working to do maybe like a product manager. There are still ways in which the project leader needs to organize folks who are part of the project, set goals, sort of measure the trajectory of the project. Like these are things that can be applied to a product manager, where you're doing the same thing, but you're shipping product rather than, or you're shipping features rather than an actual construction or sort of something you're building. So those are ways. That's just a simple example, but there are ways that you can pick out the things in your background and emphasize those over others. One easiest way to do this is, once you decide the kind of role you're looking for, be a student of reading job descriptions, different job descriptions of the same kind of role, and you're seeing the language that the employer is using. You're seeing the qualifications that they're highlighting, and you're picking those things out of your experience, and you're highlighting those other ones that are less pertinent to that, right? So that's a way to construct your resume, but that's also a way that you can talk about your experience when you're on the phone with somebody, and really drawing those parallels. Like you have to talk to recruiters like they're 5 years old and say, hey, listen, this is exactly how my last job is like the job that you're currently hiring for. You got to connect the dots, make it as much as an apples to apples comparison as possible. It's a bit harder when you're doing like a huge career shift kind of thing, but there's ways you can still make those connections for employers and recruiters alike. So, you just sort of work at getting better at that. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, what we got next? What are some advices you can give a job seeker who is new in this area? Yeah, I would say, this kind of is connected to sort of the last question a little bit. If you're, new to the area, I assume you're referring to tech. Different kind of roles. There are always parallels that you can connect and draw from past experience to the kind of role that you're looking at right now. So just like general job seeking stuff. If the new area that you're referring to is tech, if it's digital, all the recruiters are on LinkedIn. Make sure that you have an updated LinkedIn profile, because as a recruiter, I spend all of my day on LinkedIn looking at profiles, whether I'm sourcing passive candidates, trying to get them interested in a role, or if they are applicants. I usually look at the LinkedIn profiles because, well, one reason is LinkedIn organizes the information in a very, skimmable way for me. Like the information is always organized the same way on all LinkedIn profiles, versus resumes are always a little bit different, and it's harder to find what you're looking for. So I'm always just always on LinkedIn for those reasons. So having a good, a well filled out, detailed LinkedIn profile, helps you with kind of sort of SEO on LinkedIn with the good keywords for active recruiters to find you, but also it's just great for networking too. So that if you're a serious job seeker, you got to be on LinkedIn and social in that way, especially for digital and tech companies. So hopefully that gives you some idea. I'm a recent graduate, but have no work experience. Okay, I do have a significant amount of projects, nice, but it's still hard to get interviews. What suggestions would you give to improve my chances? Projects are great, like John said. John, I would be curious to get your opinion on this. My view of having projects, which are really important to see for somebody fresh out of school. I'd rather see a more fully baked out project than 3 half-baked projects. I think that's kind of more compelling to see somebody that's actually built out a thing fully, rather than sort of half-baked projects. What do you think about that, John?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think I look at a lot of GitHub repositories, and there'll be a repository. It'll be something like chess-java. Like you look, and it's something like okay, I've taken this like university course where I had to implement a chess game in Java, and this is the thing that's on my GitHub repository. In
Right.
GitHub, you can pin a couple of repositories. So I really think it's
Yes. Yeah.
less is more. You want to have a couple of repositories that are really something you've put some time into. Um, I totally agree with that. Also, I
Yeah.
think just putting them on your GitHub is not enough because, like Eddie said, he's hanging out on LinkedIn. He's going to need to see those projects kind of listed in your project section on LinkedIn as well. So make sure you're cross linking those things so anyone that's only in one place can see them. And of course, put them on your
Absolutely.
resume too.
Absolutely. Your resume, super cross-linked. And if you want to go crazy, build yourself a a personal website. People are like, that is really, it's easy for like designers are designers who do that are like, you can sort of show your style, like your taste, right? Your aesthetic as a designer. So that's such a clear way to differentiate yourself if you're using a personal website in that way, in terms of product design or just, UX, UI. For engineering, having a personal website, same kind of thing. You can house your projects there, and you can even have the project and have like your readmes on there. Put some more documentation on, like, oh, this project was solving this problem that I had. But it's also a great place for self-expression to really differentiate yourself than just the credentials of your computer science degree in your school. So cross-link those things like John said, and really fully bake out some projects to get folks interested. Yeah, and even just like um, open source contributions. It's tough to do. Like, we know it could be a great hack would be. I think this has probably happened at Genius. John, correct me if I'm wrong, but like all companies, like they have like their APIs or they have stuff on GitHub and submit a pull request or something like, hey, this use a typo here, or oh,
Yep.
hey, this is you should update this, clean up this logic a little bit. Like that's like, oh wow, and that goes straight to the team,
We have
bypasses the
purposely seek
recruiter.
people out to try to hire
Right.
them through this. Yeah.
See, there you go. So that's a great hack right there, to get the attention of a particular company, and that's sort of a deep. You're choosing a company. That's a lot of work to do. Just do for one company that may notice it and may not, but that's a huge differentiator if you have time to do it. And a company, I think, would definitely like that if they saw that.
I would never have thought of that. That's a great tip though. I love it. Because we have seen that. I've seen it in countless companies for sure.
Right. Nice. Okay. Thanks for speaking with us today, Eddie. My pleasure. What do you look for in the junior level developer? What do you expect? Um, yeah, similar to sort of what John and I have echoed. Somebody that is, doesn't just how to sort of go through the motion. Somebody that is really interested in just learning. Well, so there's two dimensions to that, right? Just loving tech, loving a particular framework, loving sort of conference talks on YouTube and retweeting them. Like you can just do that generally, just be sort of a lover of a community, or like you're super active in like the Angular community or something, right? And you go to those meetups when we can in person, or maybe they're doing them virtually now. Like you can get a little bit deeper in the penetration there, and then soon you're building a network of people that will refer you and that kind of stuff. So going in the community way, being active in that way is really important. But even if you want to further to what we just talked about, really target a particular company that you just are in love with, and you want to kind of show your interest, and you learn a ton about the company and its product, and to be really learned about a company and its history and its tech history, or like the tech projects that it has. um, you know uh, that maybe the engineering manager tweeted some obscure detail about like a tech project that they're working on. You can find those things out, and be like, hey, I heard about, so like if you write a cold email to this company you're targeting, hey, I saw that your engineering manager mentioned that you're working on this new product or something. This sounds really cool. Are you thinking about doing like this kind of thing? You're talking about things that other candidates are not. So if you want to go deep in really targeting a company, you can do that as well. But to do that for every single company is quite exhausting. I wouldn't recommend that. But maybe, you know, that one or two or three companies that you've been eyeing for a couple of years now is something that you know, you can do.
Got a lot of questions here.
All right, we're going to get through them. Don't worry, we'll get all of them. As a follow-up from the previous question, does the same advice apply for someone who is pivoting from another field or another sector in tech? Also, how to recruiters view someone who has been freelancing? All right, that last question is definitely a good one. But if someone's pivoting from another field or another sector. Okay, so you're already within tech, but you're pivoting from like another field. Maybe you're like in content marketing or something, and you want to move over to product management or something. I'm assuming that that's probably what this person means. So we'll go with that. Okay, so this is interesting. If you know, the best way to do that is internally at a company. If you happen to be working at a startup that is growing really quickly, and I saw people do this a ton at General Assembly, like the staff that was working at General Assembly, as new departments were being created, and you know, they were aggressively hiring people from other teams, like marketing, were getting into tech or getting into, you know, instruction or, you know, instructional design and stuff. And you sort of work up a good standing within the company, but then you're, you know, maybe you're taking the you know, the head of that team that you're eyeing out for coffee or something, like, hey, listen, you know, I've been really thinking about making a career switch. You know what I mean? You can voice these things, you know, respectfully to, you know, your manager and also the manager of maybe the team you're trying to target. And those kind of internal career changes are very common at startups because they're just growing so quickly. And also startups, they're not, it's probably, startups need to be, they need to be at like Series C or Series D or making a lot of money before they're starting to pay market salaries for really specialized roles where, like, you know, an external candidate will just beat you out for that kind of role because they have so much experience. If you're like Series A and Series B at a company and you want to make a move into a different department, there's a sweet spot, you know, in terms of the timing and the stage of growth at a company. So I've seen people make that internal move a lot. You know, so it's way easier internally than externally from company to company to make that kind of move. You know, so that, I mean, that's one way. Otherwise, you know, I would probably do some of the things that I mentioned, you know, before this. But the recruiters view someone who has been freelancing. I mean, it depends on the kind of role, honestly. For tech, doesn't really matter. I mean, if you can code, you can code. Like, I would say and there's been a ton of talk about, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion, but coding is not like engineering, I would say, is the most meritocratic. It's not perfect, but like, if you can code, like, you can just get the job. Like, right? I mean, even with startups back in the day, with like the whole reason the boot camp market even grew or was created is because you don't need a bachelor's degree necessarily. You don't necessarily need a computer science degree to get a good engineering job at a startup. You can learn these things. So like the sort of old signals of credentialing, like you know, you don't really need them the same way. There's sort of lower barriers to entry. So I would say, you know, I think that holds with freelancing as well. If you have been freelancing as an engineer, or even a product designer, if you've got some good clients, you've got some good work, and you're building up a body of work that you can produce in a portfolio, like that's really compelling. I would say, so for those kinds of roles, free if I'm hiring for a full-time role at Genius, that's like full stack engineer, like I'm down to look for really active freelance engineers. More so, I have more of an appetite for that than probably director of marketing, who may have been like a freelance marketer or something. Like, I think I'm just sort of less inclined to go freelance for that kind of route versus tech kind of roles. So yeah, I think it's less stigmatized, if you know, bottom line, versus other kinds of roles. Hopefully that makes sense.
Given the amount of questions remaining, I think at this point, if you could pick a couple that maybe like stand out to you, I have a couple that I think.
Yeah, if
Are,
yeah, if there's any that, I mean, some of them kind of run into each other. So
yeah, some of
any
them
ones
do.
that are
I
any ones that
was
are unique, I'm down to, yeah, hit me with them.
what are your thoughts about a candidate coming from boot camp versus self-taught? There's a couple questions about
Mm,
that.
classic. There's the self-taught, the boot camp, the comp sci grad, right? Those three are, it's been like the hottest debate. You know, I came from General Assembly, right? So I was on the side of getting boot camp grads connected. Um, I would say, and I think boot camps initially, like just even like 5 years ago, were probably way more stigmatized as like, oh, these grads aren't great, or as compared to comp sci candidates. You know, even us at Genius, we tend, in the past, we've kind of looked at boot camp grads like, oh, I don't know if. So here's the difference. It depends on the amount of experience you're hiring for, right? Most of the engineering levels that you'll see at companies are like software engineer 1, software engineer 2, 3, like staff engineer. These are levels of experience where it's like 1 to 2 years of experience, 3 to 4 years, senior, like, 5 to 6 or something. If we're hiring for senior roles, it is less somebody coming from a company that coming from a good engineering organization at a company is just a really compelling candidate. And then freelance too. I think freelance folks, depending on the kind of work that they've been working on and their level of experience, are really interesting for that. But if you're for junior roles, you have bootcamp grads, self-taught people, and comp sci grads competing for those entry-level roles. I mean, I think it's more competitive at that level, I would say. I think I think boot camp grads are less stigmatized now. Like, they show that they can do it. Because if you look, if I when I was at General Assembly in 2012, and I was helping with grads that are coming out of our programs in 2012, 2013, I still pass by their profiles on LinkedIn, and now they're like engineering manager at Etsy, engineering manager at like Square. Like, these bootcamp grads get to those levels that a comp sci grad would get. And I think once you start seeing that out, you start seeing how the proof of bootcamp grads can kind of just get there, even if they don't have necessarily like a lot of the comp sci fundamentals, an actual comp sci grad would have. But I think it levels out over those couple of years. Companies just have to think more out of the box from that sense. So I think bootcamp grads are now more competitive after you see folks have been proofing it out. With freelance, I don't know. If you're freelance, you got to do all the things that we mentioned before. You got to have a good presence on GitHub. You got to have a good, a nice personal website. You got to have some proof of work, because the person coming from another company or coming from those kinds of degrees, they can say, oh, I worked on this project that is a professional project that our company relies on to make money from. Like that's actual like professional work. Versus freelance, you have to show the professional work that you've done, rather than it just being unstructured projects, like not even in a boot camp context. You know what I mean? So it depends, but I like all of those folks' chances nowadays for more of a junior level role. Sorry, I got rambly. That was a long answer.
I was writing in the chat a little bit my opinion on this, which is that like you're saying, once you get that first job, that's the thing that matters. It doesn't matter anymore like where you went to school or
Doesn't
what your
matter.
training
Yeah,
was. It matters.
exactly.
You'll get more experience in your first month at a real job than you will in years of training in a school or boot
Yeah.
camp.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
I think
All
we have
right.
time for maybe one more question. Just
Sure. I mean, I'm
because
as long as y'all, yeah,
yeah.
I'm open as long as you all got time. Uh, which one is oh, can you connect with me on LinkedIn? Absolutely. Eddie Washington on LinkedIn. Everybody send me a connection request. Easy. That's an easy yes. No experience using React. Is it possible to get a front-end developer job having knowledge of just HTML, CSS, JavaScript, no experience using React or other frameworks? Hey, if you are dope with vanilla JavaScript, absolutely, you can just learn a framework. Like the rap on boot camps, I remember this, like getting grads over to companies. Oh, boot camp grads are so dependent on frameworks, like, rather than knowing what's going on under the hood. So if you were just great with just vanilla HTML, CSS, JavaScript, that translates to a framework very well. Rather the other way around, like you only know a framework and you've never actually written plain code before, written out the logic. So I would say, yeah, you're definitely can get a front end developer job. They'll just train you on the framework. Plus, it's all legacy code anyway. They got to bring you up on the code that somebody else has written anyway. So you're just sort of learning it regardless, rather than building things from scratch. Cool. Anything else, John, that sticks out that I couldn't knock out real quick?
I guess maybe like there's kind of a meta point here that like any tips for like stay-at-home mom or people that are a little bit older. I see a couple questions about that. So
any tips for those folks?
Meaning someone who I guess like kind of wrapping those up into one, like someone who's been out of all traditional, like out of all like office type careers or work type like job site careers,
Yeah.
Or even someone who is getting into tech now but is a little bit older.
Yeah. I mean, engineering is a great entry point back into the workforce if you've been absent for a little bit for whatever reason. That's a huge reason, folks. The bootcamp world exists, and people are more self-taught nowadays. I mean, you all, for those folks, right? And then there's like the resume gap thing. Like, you can just combat that with doing well on take homes. And what is that? There's a website. What is it called? It's like Triple Byte or something. There are now websites. There are now companies that help companies to evaluate recruit engineers. And there's like Triple Byte thing. Is like there's it may be triple. It's either Triple Byte or something else, right? Okay, so with Triple Byte, you can sign up for it and just like you pass one of their tests and then you're like certified Triple Byte or something, and then they start funneling opportunities to you, or sort of funneling your profile to companies that maybe don't have a person like me and they need help technically screening engineers. And Triple Byte is an amazing intermediary for that. So
I wish I had thought of this. This is like the coolest idea.
That's good, right? Like when I first learned about it, I was like, oh wow, this is cool. And I think it was just Triple Byte. I think there's other companies like this that can be, right? It's an amazing resource that can be these sort of intermediary stepping stones to get, because now you have this company that's credentialed you, and now they're like, they're endorsing you as a candidate, and you have like now this sort of this street cred that you didn't have if your GitHub's not doing it for people, or your personal website's not doing it. So those are really amazing resources for re-entering the workforce, especially with gaps in resumes or gaps on LinkedIn. There's definitely absolutely great ways to do it. But ultimately, lastly, I'll say on that, there's no better time to be entering the workforce now, because all companies are remote, and all engineering teams are remote now. So that means no matter where you live, you don't have to live in a hub where you would be interviewing for an on-site job. But remote, it is now like, the default. So you now have opportunities no matter where you live for companies all over the country, internationally as well. I think somebody had a question about international applicants. I'd have to do, I wonder what visas would, that's another can of worms. I don't know the answer to sort of remote international folks. But I think like the floodgates are open now. So it is an amazing time to be on the job market, because all engineering teams for all organizations are now remote. And all companies that were not digital before the pandemic, you better believe they're digital now, or they're starting to build digital functions and teams. So there's even more demand than before the pandemic.
Once the company sees how low their bills go, not paying for an office for the past
Right.
year, they're not likely to go back to it.
There you go. Absolutely. Yeah. So use, personal website, GitHub, Twitter, use those as good signals if you're trying to get into it, but use those other intermediaries like TripleByte, and there's more things like that, and do more research into that. There's ways to kind of get your foot in the door here for companies that need engineers more now than ever,
Cool. I think we have to call it, because we're supposed to head off
Right.
for a
You gotta
break for a minute, and then we
Cool,
got to
cool.
get back into the content. But it's been great having you. I really appreciate you spending some time with us today.
For sure. Yeah. Add me
So
on
we'll
LinkedIn.
drop your LinkedIn
Yeah.
in. I send an email after every chat or every session, so we'll drop your LinkedIn in there, or I'll put your Twitter in there too,
Do it.
so
Twitter.
people can
Absolutely.
find you everywhere.
For sure. Yeah. Hit me up. And I'm just Eddie. I'm Eddie EDDIE @genius.com too. You can email me, and yeah, John, let me know. I'm happy to come back and talk more, and answer questions that I didn't get a chance to answer this time.
Awesome. Yeah, that would be great.
No worries. All right, y'all. Great
Cool.
chatting. See you
See you soon.
later. All right. Bye.
All right. I hope everyone had a good time talking with Eddie. Eddie is awesome. He's a good friend and a good recruiter and great person. So if anyone has questions for him, feel free to hit him up on LinkedIn. But also, if you appreciated the time that Eddie spent with us, please, when I send out the link that includes like his Twitter handle, give him a follow if you're interested in the things that he talked about. Just like as always. Okay, I'm going to jump back into the homework. Is everyone ready to keep going? My code space is having trouble again. Okay, cool. So we're back in here. I'm going to bring the Q&A back here. I'm going to bring my chat back, and we are going to keep going. I'm going to dismiss the questions that are here. So I apologize if your question didn't get answered. If I see any here. And I'm only doing this so that I can have a clean slate, so I can see the questions that you ask after this. Unfortunately, there's no way for me to clear them all at once. Okay, cool. We're back. Okay, the next session of the homework is exercise 3, which is to create a chat directory page that lists your chats along with links to each one. We want to use link to create those links. So when I think about a directory page, what I normally think about is a chats index page. Now we've already chosen to make the current route that we have called index. So before I even get started, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename that route. And Rails has a convention for what you would name that action, and it's to call it show. So we're just going to rename the thing we have now to show. And then in order to keep everything working, we have to go to our route and change the name in our route. So we should have things continue to work. So I'm just going to refresh this browser. It's going to take a second because the code space was down. And then we should see it. It looks like down here. Just bear with me for 1 second because the code space was down while we were there. So okay, /chats/books. It says that we're missing a template, and the reason that we're missing a template is because we have a template, but it's still named index. So our chats controller is now called show, but it's trying to find a file over here called show.html.erb. So all I'm going to do is go rename it. Rename it to show.html.erb. And then when I refresh, it works again. So I've taken my index route and I've moved it to show. And the only reason that I'm doing that is because I want to introduce now a index route that'll hold my directory. For this, I'm going to use /chats. The controller name will be the chats controller, and the action will be the index action. Hopefully this part is clear to everyone. Okay, so let's go to that route. It's going to error, and it's telling us exactly what's wrong, which is that we have not defined an index action on the chats controller. So let's go make one. And remember, when I make a new action, the first thing I like to do is I like to put something inside of it that I know is going to work. That's just to make sure that it's correctly showing up here. Once I know that it's correctly showing up, I can remove that and I can get to the next point, which is creating a variable that holds all of the chats. So I'm going to make an instance variable called @chats. I'm going to set it to equal to chat.all. Which remember, chat.all is going to return an array-like object that holds all of the different chats. Now, to wire the rest of the thing together, I need to create a new view. I'm going to call it the same name as the action, which is index.html.erb. We get into that file. I'm going to just write hello world just to verify that we've got that part wired up, which we do. And now I can create my iteration, which is chats.each do chat. Remember, this is just Ruby again. And then inside of here, I'll create a div tag so that there's some separation between them. And then I will output the name of the chat. So if we refresh now, we'll see books. Yes, I can. Sorry. We'll see books. Now, the last part is that I wanted it to be a link. So remember, if I want a link, I use link to, and I can do chat.name, and I can use chat path. And remember, because our chat show takes in the chat name and not an ID, we need to manually pass that name here. So if we refresh now, I broke it. It's saying that it cannot find chat path. And that is because in our routes file, we don't have as chat. Remember, we have to have the as to wire it up. So if we go here now, you're going to see the name of the chat, and then you'll see the link. Click the link, we're able to get into the chat. And now if we wanted to have a link back, we can go back into our show controller. We can do link to all chats, and we'll write chats here. To get that to work correctly, we have to go back to our routes file, which if I can find it, will be here. And we have to add as chats. Refresh, and now we got a link. Go back to all chats, go into books. Back to all chats, into books. Okay, so that's the homework. I'm going to answer a few questions about the homework before we keep going. So the first question is, hi, John, what version of Sqlite 3 should be in the gem file? I think it doesn't matter. Whatever came with your Rails is totally fine. I'll show you my gem file in case it's helpful. So I have 1.4. Andrew says, how does Rails know to look for an HTML file in the view and when you render what you wrote in the controller? Yeah, so I want you to imagine that at the end of every one of these, there's a call that looks like this: render show, render index. All it does is if you don't write one, it assumes that you want to render the same name as the action name. So there's just some code in Rails that says, if you get to the end of an action and no one has called render, then render the thing with the same name. You can also write this. If you prefer to write this, that's fine. So it'll work the same. If I refresh, it still works. Yeah, if you wrote render plain, it's not going to look for HTML because you'll be outputting a string. Oloason says, can you try using resources so that it reflects on the link to? Yeah, I can try to show you how resources will work. But first, in order to show how resources work, we will need to make it so that instead of chat name coming in here, the ID of the chat comes in here. So we would have to change this to params of ID. This would be chat ID. And we would be looking up by the ID like this, chat.where ID is chat ID dot first. In order to account for that change, we also have to go to the routes file and change this to chat/ID. So now the site should still work just the same, which is that you have the chats. And when you click into one, sorry, I broke it. How did I break it? Oh, I broke it because the link is wrong. So in our, it's a little hard to make this change because of how things are set up, but this should just be chat's path of chat, like we saw yesterday, which is the same as saying chat path of chat.id. So if I refresh this and I go to the chats, you'll see now that there's a link and there's a link back. And the only difference that I've made is now up here, instead of it being the name, it's the ID. And that sets us up to use resources, because if we go back to our routes file, which I'll do now, you'll see that these two lines are the exact line that we would get by writing resources chats. Remember, we get a show that looks just like this, and we get an index action that looks just like this. So if I comment both of these out, I would expect that the app still works just how it does now. So I'll refresh, and I can show you that it still works. Anonymous attendee says, what does show as do again? I don't quite understand the question, but if you can rephrase it, I'll try to answer it. I'm not exactly sure what you're asking. This was without resources. You're going to show it with resources. Yep, I just did. And for some reason, my chat/name route needs to be named as chat/name rather than chat. That is very confusing, and I don't think you can message me. That it seems like something else might be wrong. Regex says, I did def render show. Def show render show. So basically the thing I have here. And it went into an infinite loop. You probably have render show like this with a colon. So that's not what you want. You want the string. And this is also a good reason why it's just best to not write these. It's just easier to leave them off because they're confusing and they work in different ways depending on how you use them. My question was about, what does show as in the routes file do? Oh, okay. So what as does is it names the route so that you can watch the lecture from yesterday, kind of talk more about that, but it makes it so that when you do something like chats here, that you're referring to the same named route from the routes file. So you're creating essentially a name that maps to that path so that you can use that everywhere. I'd really recommend just watching yesterday's lecture if you haven't. I see. Rajesh, yes, that makes sense. If you, so Rajesh is saying that what he was actually doing is he was doing this and seeing an infinite loop. And yeah, you're going to see an infinite loop because when this tries to run show, it's going to call the same method, and then it's going to try to run show again. It's going to call the same method, try to run show again over and over again. So again, it's easier just to not write them. Someone wants to see the controller for chats. This is it. And anonymous attendee says end root file. I'm not sure what that means, but if you clarify your question a bit, I'll be happy to try to answer it. Okay, so I have to get into some new content, and I'm going to do that now. So I think it was asked yesterday how you end up deleting things. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time showing you how to delete things, and it is only so that I can show you some other stuff. So imagine we wanted to, on the index page, be able to have a button for each chat that lets you delete it. So that's this page here. And we have a chat, and we want to be able to have a button next to this that says delete. So we can do that. What I'll do is I will make a link to chat.name, and I'll write chat path chat. So the same thing that I wrote before. And you could also just write chat there. If anyone is interested in that, this can just be chat. So let's write it out though, chat path chat. And then I'm going to write at the end method delete. I go back here and I refresh this page. Oh, we should, instead of chat.name, we'll write something in here. So I'll say delete forever. Let's refresh that. So now we have the original link that does the thing that it always did, but we have this extra link over here that allows us to delete that chat forever. Okay, so let's click it. Okay, so when we click it, it says the action destroy could not be found for Chatscontroller. So what it's saying is that everything's wired up correctly already, because remember our routes file is using resources. So like I said the other day, our routes file automatically sets up the index route, the show route, the update route, the edit route, new route, create route, and it also sets up a delete route. Okay, or it's actually called destroy. So these are all the things you get by doing resources. So, and you can see the evidence of that because when I go to actually delete something, it's actually trying to call an action on the Chatscontroller. So what do we have to do as developers is just go define the destroy method and just define what it does. So let's go back to our Chatscontroller and let's define destroy. So what does destroy have to do? First, it has to get the chat ID. Okay, and then it has to get the chat. And then I want it to destroy the chat. Remember, we learned that when we were learning the basics of active record, we learned about the destroy method. And then when it's done, I want to redirect to chats. Okay, so we haven't formally learned of this yet, but I think I showed it yesterday a little bit. This is just a way to say redirect to, and then you can use any helper here. So this is actually when you write chats like this, you're really saying chats URL, which is going to redirect it to whichever route has the as chats part, which is something we get for free from resources. We get an index route that is as chats. Okay, so I'm going to write it the way that we've been writing it everywhere else, which is redirect to chats. Okay, so I think this should work. Does this make sense? Let's try it out. I'm going to refresh this page, hit enter. And now look what's here, empty page. So that empty page means that the thing that we tried to delete is gone. So I'm going to go write some code now that is going to give us some of them back, because having them gone is it's not great because we can't test things. So what I'll do is I will make use of arrays. I'm going to say books, and I'm going to say songs dot each, and I'm going to say topic, and then I will do I'll do chat dot create name topic. So I'm using each to set up multiple ones at once rather than calling chat multiple times. So now we refresh. Boom, we got our two chats back. And I can prove to you that delete works one at a time. So I click delete forever. And as I click them, my chats go away. And I can bring them right back just by running the same line again. So refresh and they're back. Okay. So now we know how to delete something via controller action, but there might be something that people think is a little weird here, which is that if we go and look at the code that we just wrote, the show action and the destroy action, they start the same way, meaning that first they take in the chat ID, then they find the chat and put it into an instance variable, and then they do their own thing. So in the case of destroy, destroys it and redirects somewhere. And in the case of show, it captures the messages and then renders the show action. Okay. So there's actually a way in Rails that we can combine those behaviors. So we can use what's called before action. And what we'll do here is we will put a colon and we'll write load chat. And we actually can specify that we only want to do that for certain endpoints. So the way that this should read is we're going to define a before action, and we're only going to run it for the show and destroy endpoints, and it is called load chat. And then by doing that, we get to go define a private method called load chat. And what will happen is for the show and destroy endpoints, load chat will run before the action runs. So now I'm able to take some shared code and move it in to this before action and delete it from the two places. So now I've taken my code and I've done what's called drying it up. Remember, we keep talking about dry it up, which means don't repeat yourself. So this is the dry version. It does the exact same thing. If you don't want to dry your code up, you don't have to, but it is good practice. It's a good habit to get into. Felipe says, can we call this a mini library? Are you talking about this controller when you talk about a mini library? I suppose parts of it. I mean, like you're creating a behavior, this thing here, that you can use in multiple places. Another way to say it is just you're having a private method and you're calling the private method, using the private method to dry up the behavior. Anonymous attendee says, could you please explain again? Yes. So all the, I assume you're talking about before actions. So what before action does is you pass it the name of a method that you want to call. In this case, I'm going to call that method load chat. And then you can optionally, and you don't have to write this part, you can optionally say that you only want to run that load chat method when accessing the show and destroy actions. And the reason we do that is because if we didn't have this only here, we just had just load chat, then load chat would run before all of these. And the problem there is that if load chat runs before the index action, it's going to look for a chat that doesn't exist. Because remember, the index action is just /chats. There is no /ID afterward. So only in the show and destroy are we talking about a single chat. So in those, we want to do this. And you can know that you wanted the before only on those, because if you remember, when we go back to our original code here, only in those two endpoints was this code that was duplicated. So all I'm doing is I'm seeing that I'm doing the same thing in two places. And watch, if I wanted to, imagine I didn't want to use the before action, what I could do is I could say, well, I'm going to take this behavior and I'm going to put it into this load chat method. And then in my show action, I'll just call load chat. And then since this is the same, I can erase it. And I'll also just call load chat there. So that's all the before action is doing, is it's saying, call load chat only before the show endpoint and the destroy endpoint. And by doing that, we don't need these calls to load chat anymore because it happens for us. Does that help clarify what this before action is? I don't need you to write your code with before action, but you are likely to see before actions in Rails applications. So you need to know that it exists so that when you see it used, you know what it's doing. So basically, when you read a line like this, all I want you to think is in the show and destroy methods, just imagine that the first line was a call to that method in only those two. That's what the before action is doing. It's saying before you run the action, run this method. So that it's an easy way to take a bunch of behavior and put it in here. So a way that this might be used in a Rails app is you might say like before action must be logged in. So you check to make sure that the user is logged in the before action. So then each of your things doesn't need to individually check whether or not the person's logged in. You just automatically have checked all of them. So before actions have a lot of uses that we'll probably see some of as we get going more. Yes, you can use load chat as a method part of another new method. Yes. Okay. So we just covered how to use the delete endpoint. We covered how to use before action, and we covered how to use redirect to. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give, I think, a slower introduction than I tried to give previously to Rails forms. And then we're going to talk about nested resources, which is going to be fun. So I'll stop for a second just to get these couple questions. Dash says, can you show index views again for the delete link? Yeah, I'd be happy to. So it looks like this. It just has method delete on the end. And if you look up the documentation, there are other things you can put here. Like if you wanted a confirmation dialog, you can do like this. Data confirm, are you sure? And then what you get as a result of that is when you delete, you get this little pop-up. So Rails gives you a lot of like nice behaviors for free that you can go explore on your own. I'm just kind of teaching you the basics here. Anonymous attendee says, so delete is a get. I'm not going to go into that piece in the class too much, but it's not, it's a delete. Oliver Basin says, so what does it look like when you have multiple before actions? Yeah, so they just execute in order. So if you had multiple before actions, you can do that. Say before action, redirect if chat is about books. And you maybe only want to run that on the show endpoint. And then you can implement a private method that does this. And it could say if chat name is books, then redirect to root. Anonymous Handy says, what will be the route for delete in the routes RB file? I think you'll have to look that up on your own, or if you message me privately, I can send it to you, but I don't want to confuse people by writing it. Although just message me and I'll answer. I'll answer out of band. Sewell says, are we going to learn user login authentication in this class, or we have to learn it on our own? I think we probably won't cover it here, but I want to encourage you that it's not much more difficult. It's really, if we learn forms and we learn controller actions that can take in inputs of forms, that we can use that plus a couple more tools that we're going to learn to be able to build authentication. So while we're not going to cover authentication directly, we will by the end of the course, I think, have enough tools to have you building authentication. Okay, cool. Okay, so a form is some markup that we can put on a page. I'm going to create a form. In the example, sorry, one more. In the example of these before actions, they just run in order. So whichever one's defined first runs first. Okay, so we're going to create a form. We're going to create this form in order to create new chats. So what I will do is I'm going to do, remember the format is a call to the method form4. And to it, you're going to pass a new chat object. And then we do F. So this is just a regular Ruby block, just like each would be, except this one is called form4. And then inside of here, we can render our form controls. So we have the text field, which is the name. And remember, we can also give it a second argument, and we can say name. So if we look at what that looks like, we're going to see this. Now, this is a box that I can type inside of. Okay, so if I right click on this and I look at the inspect view, you'll see what gets output is this. It's a form. It's just another HTML tag, except Rails has handled all of the nitty gritty of how to render that HTML tag. Additionally, has included things like a CSRF token. So it's made your form essentially secure and done a bunch of stuff that if you were to implement forms yourself, you probably would not remember to do. So Rails does those things for you. And then up here, you'll see that the action is /chats. So that's where it's going to send the form to. So if I type in here and I type in books, and I just hit enter, look what it says. This is pretty crazy. It says the action create could not be found for Chatscontroller. So just like we saw for destroy, create is already wired up. It's already done. Like we already have our create endpoint. It's already sitting there for us. So all we have to do is go into the controller and make it. So in here, we'll make a create endpoint. In our create endpoint, we can actually, let's run that and let's just run it empty. So when I run it empty, you can probably guess what it's going to say next. It's not. Okay, so we want to do something. Let's get the name. And we'll do params of chat name. And if you're wondering why I'm doing params of chat name, I can show you just in a second. But let's actually, I'll show you right now. So if we go back to the form, the reason I'm doing params of chat name instead of just params of name, it's because Rails has defined the name field on this input to be chat square brace name. So the thing that we're actually getting in the controller in the params object here, the params looks like this. It has chat, and then that goes into another hash, and that hash has the name sitting inside of it. So this is what params looks like. So because params looks like this, we need to get it out using params of chat to get into the inner hash, and then that of name to get into the value of the inner name. And then we can do chat.create, and then we'll just pass the name to it. That will return us a new chat object. And then we can choose what to do. In this case, I'm just going to redirect back to chats. So when you create a new chat, it'll just go back to that chats endpoint. So let's try it out. Books, hit enter. People, hit enter. Other, whatever. Whatever. It's like, oh, we made a mistake. We can just delete it. Type in other, it shows up again. So we made a form. The form is secure. And we got all of that with just this code. And remember, there's also the ability to do f.submit. When we do f.submit, that's just going to give us a little button. So instead of knowing that we have to hit enter, we can type button and click the button instead. Okay, I am going to and I'm going to answer a few questions that I wrote down about forms first, and then I'm going to answer the questions that you've all put in the Q&A. So the first thing is, what is a form? I tried to answer this a little bit earlier, but a form is just another HTML tag. So these are just sitting on the page. And the only difference between it and all the other HTML tags is that you are not going to write it yourself ever. Instead, what you're going to do is you're going to use the form for helper method. So that's the one that we're looking at here. Form for takes in an object and it yields in here the F, which you'll get in the block, the same way that you would get something from each. You can call these methods on it to output controls. So in this case, we're outputting a text field. In this case, we're outputting a submit. There are other things you can output. You can output radio buttons or checkboxes or all kinds of other stuff. But I guess at the end of the day, what I'm trying to say is that form for is just a method that returns some HTML. Why do we need forms? We need forms because forms are the way that we get users to type something in to get something into our backend application. If we don't have forms, then we can't get the data in. So there are definitely applications out there that don't need forms, but for the most part, all applications need forms. For example, on like Twitter, the web app, when you're typing into a text input, and then when you click tweet, you're actually clicking a submit button, and then it's going to a backend server. So like if we wanted to build Twitter, like right here, we could basically do that, like rename name to tweet, rename create chat to submit, and then like have each of these just be the body. That's, I mean, basically what Twitter is. I mean, it's like they have to do a lot of work to make it scale, obviously, but at the end of the day, it's very simple. Okay, so now I'm going to answer your questions about routes, and then I have, about forms, and then I'm going to show you a different kind of form. Okay, anonymous attendee says, can we write regex in Ruby? You can. They work very similar to how they work in Perl. You can just Google regex in Ruby and you'll find out. Anonymous attendee says, when you delete and recreate a code space, what gems do you have to install? If you look at the Slack, there should be a list. If someone has a link or something, you can place it here. We can also help you after class. Manon says, what is the authenticity token? It's a great question. I almost don't want to talk about it, but I guess I'll talk about it briefly, which is that when you submit a form on the internet, it's very important to know that the person that typed on here and then click the button. Remember, when you click the button, you're actually making another request to the backend server. So the authenticity token is a special random number. In this case, this like series of letters and numbers that gets generated when you send the request. And then unbeknownst to you, Rails handles all of this. It looks on the next request and sends that little string along with the request so that it can validate to make sure that the person who typed in the form is the same person who tried to submit the form. so that someone can't essentially send a request as, without having to go through the form. So I hope that makes sense. You need the authenticity token in order to validate that the person who saw the form is the same person submitting the form. Rails handles all of that for you. You don't even have to really think about it at all. Rubina says, what command calls create internally? The Rails router via resources ends up calling create. Anonymous attendee says, chat here is the name of the model. Yes. I think, but there's chat in a lot of places here. Chats here is the name of the resources, the path. But yes, it is also the name of the model. Regex says, so there's no need for a submit button. I put one. You don't have to have one. The way that forms work is that if you hit enter inside of any of the submits that are in a form, it submits the form. So you don't need it. And then someone asked to see the view. Again, this is the view. Yeah, when you do chat.new here, all it does is it says, well, I know that you're creating a form for submitting a new chat object. So when you're trying to submit something that hasn't been saved yet, then that's a create call. So Rails routes it to create. So Rails is smart enough to say, okay, I need to build a URL for creating a new chat. And it knows that that is /chats, a post called the /chats, which again, it handles all of that for you. Manon says, if I understand the endpoint and method terminology correctly, basically endpoints are blueprints of routes to methods. Yeah, an endpoint is basically a URL. It's like it's a thing that you go to, so viewing this, you've hit an endpoint by doing that. When you click create chat, you're hitting an endpoint. You can think of an endpoint as analogous to a single entry in the routes file or a single action in your Rails app. They're all kind of the same concept. Okay. Now I'm going to show you something else, which is that sometimes you have something and you want to be able to edit it. So we're going to do link to, we're going to write edit. And then instead of chat path, I'm going to write edit chat path. Okay. So if I do that and I refresh this page, all of a sudden we're going to see this edit button pop up. It's pretty amazing because we didn't actually implement anything to do with editing. So let's click edit and see what happens. And look, the action edit could not be found for the chats controller. The reason that it works automatically is because, like I said, resources defines create, show, edit, update, destroy, or sorry, destroy. It defines all of these for you. So we have edit. Someone says we now have more functionality than Twitter. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so now we want to edit. So all we have to do is go to the chats controller. Let's go define our edit endpoint. Okay. So now we're in here. And what does edit need in order to render? So in order to render an edit form, we need to have the chat. Okay, so to get the chat, I can just go to my before action, which I've already defined, and I can just add edit to the list. Now, when I get to edit, I'm automatically going to have @chat, which already contains the chat. And I didn't have to do anything. So hopefully that's showing you a little bit of the value of having these before actions. I've defined a new action and automatically have the behavior that I need. So our edit method is actually going to be empty because there's nothing else that we have to do. We have to load the chat and then we have to render the edit page. So let's refresh again. And look what it says. It says Chatscontrolleredit is missing a template. Okay. The reason it's missing a template is, of course, because we haven't added a template. So let's go make one. We're going to call it edit.html.erb. Now here, we're going to say editing chat.name, and I'll put that inside of h2. Okay, and now I need a form for, now normally I would write chat.new, but remember in this case, we're not editing a new chat. What we're actually editing is just a chat. So we're going to write it like that. And in here we'll do f.text field name, just like we did before. And in here we'll do f.submit. Okay. Let's refresh. Yeah, so what's happened here is that we've automatically filled in the values of the form. We've changed the button to say update cart. And actually, if we go inspect the form, you'll see what's happening here, which is that now the form, the action is actually /chats/7. So Rails, by receiving here a @chat object instead of chat.new, has determined, oh, that's an object that has already been saved to the database. So this is a form for an update. So what it's done is it's automatically said, oh, you're creating a text field for the name. Well, I know what the name is already. And oh, you want a submit button? Well, I know that this is an update, so I'm going to make it say the right thing. So we automatically get this form for name, and check it out when I click update. Does anyone have a guess what's going to happen when I click update? I'll just click it. Look, the action update could not be found for Chatscontroller. And it's because Rails also has defined already the update action. So now all we have to do is go implement the update action. Okay, so how do we implement the update action? Well, we know that update is going to need to have the information about the current chat. So let's start by adding to this list. Just by adding to that list, we now down here have @chat. Okay, we have already a way here to get the new name. So let's grab that. And then all we have to do is chat.update name to be the new name. We can even call it new name if we want. And then we need to redirect to somewhere. So I'll just redirect to chats again. Okay, so let's try out our new behavior. Let's refresh, enter. I'm going to edit button. I'm going to change it to buttons. I'm going to click update and look. Yes, so edit and update go hand in hand. And actually, there's a thing called new and create. Those also go hand in hand. We're not using new here because instead we're just putting the form directly on this page. But if you wanted to use new, you would essentially put this form on a different page. Rubino asks, so we didn't need to write anything in the edit action. And that's right, we didn't, but technically we did, because remember, technically this is doing that. Technically it has a before action, so it is loading the chat. The only reason that we can have it empty is because the load chat is actually a before action and the render edit call is implied. So the two lines that would be inside of our edit call, they don't need to be there because they're both happening somewhere else. So edit is empty. Anonymous attendee says, what's the difference between edit and update? So edit is the page that shows the form, and update is the action that happens when you actually click submit. So this is edit, that is update. Regex says, so you selected songs. Why was the link chat/7? Because the ID is up in the URL. Remember, that's the ID of the song's endpoint. If you're interested in how to fix that, you can look up a thing called toParam if you wanted this to say songs up here. I'm just not going to cover it in the class. So /chats/7, it looks it up by the database ID. Araso says, what if we wanted to implement create a chat on a different page, not index? I actually will show that because I think it's kind of the last piece of the resources thing. So let's go to the index view. Now the question is, instead of this form, what if we wanted to have a link to, and we wanted to write new chat? Then what we could do is new chat path. Okay, I'm going to refresh this page, and you're going to see all of a sudden button shows up, it says new chat. But we haven't defined anything for new chat. And the reason that we didn't have to is because, remember, the routes file, when you use resources, defines new, create, edit, update, show, destroy. So we got new for free. So if I click it, it's going to say, oh, there is no action new for chats controller. But it's like, I can go make one. So we make def new. This is empty because we don't have to do anything inside of it. But what we do have to do is create a new HTML file. And in that HTML file, all I'm going to put is the form. So save that, go to new, put that in there. And now if you take a look, we got the form, the new thing, create chat. Now it's there. You have the new chat button, click it, and put something in, and click save. And yes, the exercise, I hope this is a calmer, better introduction to forms than we gave previously. I hope that it makes more sense for people. And if people are interested, you can go back to, you should be able to go back to session 8 now and complete exercise 3. Louis says, in this case, the params are not coming from the URL. That's right. These forms are what are called, they're called post forms. So the URL does not contain the params. They're hidden. They don't show up here. They show up in a different way to get to the server. Soul says it will be request. Yep, that's correct. And that is also correct. Cool. Okay. Now, oh my God, we learned so much. We learned edit, update. We learned about all different kinds of resources. We went over the homework. Now we are going to do one more thing, because there always has to be that thing that kind of like pushes things kind of off into the distance. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go into the chats controller. Sorry, I'm going to go into the routes file. And I'm going to do something that we haven't done yet, which is I'm going to create a block with the resource. And I'm going to write inside of that block resources messages. This is referred to, as Oliver says, as nested resources. And I would love to show you how they work. So imagine you're in a chat. So the route here is chats/7. Okay. Now we know that we can create a chat using the new chat URL. Remember, we just implemented new chat path that gets you the path to the page where you create a new chat. Now imagine here that we wanted to have a new message path. So it was a path for creating a new message within this chat, not just like in general, but like specifically within this chat. So let's try to do it. Let's go over to our chats controller. It's the show endpoint. And in here, I'm going to write something. I'm going to write link to, I'm going to say new message. And then I'm going to write new chat message path. I'll show you what that does. Look, it just works. It shows up here. Okay, so let's break down what I did here. This is just like I had before, the new part. This is just like I had before, the path part. And then in the middle here, you see that I'm not only writing chat, I'm also writing message. Okay, and then I'm passing the chat. Let's check out this, this link and see what it looks like. Look, it's generating a link to /chats/7, meaning now we're inside of that particular chat, /messages/new. So it's doing the same thing that it would do like a new chat, except this one is now inside of a particular chat, creating a new message. Okay, should we click it and see what happens? All right, let's click it. Okay, here's what it says. Uninitialize constant messages controller. So what it's saying is that the routing's working correctly. We just haven't created the controller yet. We haven't created messages controller. If I roll down a little bit here, we should see maybe somewhere near the bottom, we should see this. So Rails here is showing us the parameters that it's getting for this request. And look what it's done. Rails has taken the ID of the chat. And because in this context, it can't call it ID because ID is the name that is reserved for the message ID in the show and edit endpoints. It is referring to the chat ID as chat_ID. So even before we go implement the messages controller, we can see here that we have access to the chat ID, which we're going to need in order to create the message in the right place. Okay, so let's put it together. We're going to go down here. We're going to Rails G controller messages. Hit enter. Now we've got a messages controller show up here. If I refresh again, I'm going to get a slightly different error. Now it says the action new could not be found for messages controller. And in here, I can go implement new. And I'm actually going to go implement a before action. And it's going to be called load chat. So what the before action is going to do, because all of the interaction with messages is always in the context of an individual chat, we're going to use before action to always load that chat before we do anything with messages. So we'll define load chat. We need to get the chat ID, which we just saw on the previous page is stored in a params called chat ID. So we'll call this a variable chat ID, and then we'll say @chat is equal to chat dot where ID is chat ID dot first. So now every method that we go and implement in this messages controller knows what chat it's talking about. So we can actually go implement this new file, new.html.erb, and we can write something like creating a new message for chat.name. Refresh. We're going to see that it works. We could even add a link if we wanted to. We could say link to cancel, and that could just be chat path chat. So if I refresh that, now we're going to have a cancel link that'll just bring us back to the chat. Okay, now the last thing is we need to be able to obviously create a form, because you can't create a message without a form. So we're going to do form 4. Something is going to have to go here, then do F. And message has a text field which contains a body, and it's going to have a submit button. Okay, now what do we put here? What goes in the XXXXX? What goes here is an array, which first contains the chat, and then contains a new message. So remember, when we're passing to form 4, we're essentially creating this. Actually, an easier way to think about this is, remember we did message.new like this. If we just wrote message.new, then what's going to happen is this is going to try to create a form with the path that looks like this /messages. But we haven't actually defined a root resource for messages. We only have a nested resource for messages. So we actually need our path to look like this. We need it to look like /chat/7/messages. So we can fix that by adding a URL parameter here that says chat messages path. So that's probably clearer to say it that way. So message.new, but by default, it wouldn't know where to send those requests. So we have to tell it where to do it. And we're specifically saying that it goes to the chat messages path for this particular chat. So if I refresh now and I inspect this form, you'll see that the actual place where it's going to is /chats/7/messages. So that is the create endpoint for the nested route messages inside of chats. And the only reason that we have to do this URL part here at all, again, is because messages lives inside of chats. Does this make sense? Why you need a special URL? You're basically telling it where to send the request when something gets typed in this field. So without this URL piece, it's not going to be able to find the right place to send that request to. So I'm going to type something in. I'm going to click create. And look what it says. It says the action create could not be found for messages controller. And that makes sense because we haven't implemented it yet. So let's go implement create. It's going to look just like kind of the other one we did. We can get the body, and to get the body, we're going to get the message params and body. And then we're going to do @chat.messages.create. And that's going to create the chat. Remember, you can chain these together. If you prefer to write it a different way, you can do message.create, chat ID is @chat.id, and body is body. These are the same. Either way you write it is fine. So if the first one makes more sense to you, don't worry about not getting the second one yet. After you do a create, we need to redirect somewhere. So in this case, we'll just redirect to chat path of chat. So now if I do it, you'll see my message. I can click new message. I can say hello. I can click create message. Okay. I imagine that there are going to be some questions about nested routes. So please ask them. Let's figure it out together. I'm going to wait because we went so far over on the Talkie Tuesday or whatever. I'm going to spend some time now kind of going over this again before I show the homework. Okay, so Rubina says, I am totally lost. Why did we need the messages controller? Pace is very fast now. Yes, the pace, we want to keep the pace low, but we want to keep stretching people. So I think like we keep doing this thing where like the last 20 minutes, we introduce a brand new concept. In this case, I'm introducing a brand new concept called nested routes. And that can feel a little jarring. And I would say what you have to do is like, if you don't get that final concept, if you don't get the last thing, it's okay. It's okay to do research and to ask questions. And if you want to ask me questions, we can spend more time on it. But if we don't keep moving, then we won't keep learning. We won't keep seeing new things. So the reason I had to make a messages controller is because, remember, I'm creating here a nested route. So if I go to my routes folder, I've created resources chats, and inside of it, I've created resources messages. So the same way as if we just created another resource, if resources messages was sitting out here, I still would need to create a messages controller, because remember, resources messages uses controller messages, which is going to be messages controller. So the reason I had to create messages controller is because you have to create messages controller anytime that you do something with resources. So it's not any different, but when I put it in here, the only thing that does change is that now everywhere that I want to use a path that talks about an individual message, now it needs to also contain the information about the chat that that message belongs to. Because if it didn't, there would be no way to build the URL. Let's look at the URL again. So the URL for this new message has to contain information about the chat, because we need to be able to create a message for a particular chat. So the URL is /chats/7/messages/new. So we have to be able to pass the chat. Otherwise, we'll never be able to get the 7 that refers to the chat that we are creating the message for. So we have /chats7/messages/new. We get that via this idea of nested routes. Erica asks, so does every table have its own controller? No, not necessarily, but for the most part, that is how things will work out. So it's not a requirement. For example, there can be controllers that don't have tables. There can definitely be tables that don't need to ever present anything, but for the most part, they'll line up with each other. And it's convenient to be able to use the same names because they're talking about similar concepts. So if you talk about messages, whether you're talking about it at the controller layer or you're talking about it at the model layer, it's still called a message. So it's not that they're a one-to-one mapping, but you do use the same names for the two of them. Anonymous attendee says, is it possible for you to go through a nested resource again? Yes, I would be happy to. So first, I am going to create a resource. In this case, I will call it, I guess we'll go back to our cars example maybe. So I'm going to erase these cars so that they don't get in my way. And I'm going to say cars. And we're just going to start by implementing the base cars behavior. So we'll go into our cars controller. We'll go in here and I don't know, let's see how much of it just works. So we'll go to /cars. Okay, so this is our cars endpoint. We currently use this render cars method. I'm going to modify that. So I will, maybe I'll just create a new concept actually, because it's going to be a lot of modification. So our new concept will be, someone have a good one. Resources. I guess we haven't done restaurants in this app, have we? Yeah, I'll do restaurants. Okay, so resources restaurants. So what I get for free out of that, and I think this is probably not the part that you are interested in, but we'll get there, is I get /restaurants and I go there and it says uninitialized constant restaurants controller. And the reason is because we don't have a restaurants controller. So we'll do Rails generate controller restaurants. We do that on the left side. We're now going to have a restaurants controller and refresh again. And it says action index can't be found. So we're going to go implement index. And in index, we'll just do at restaurants equals restaurant.all. So save that. It says restaurants controller is missing a template. Yeah, it's because we haven't made one. So we'll go down into our views folder into the restaurants subdirectory, and we're going to create a new file that we'll call index.html.erb. So in here, you can say all the restaurants. Refresh, and we'll see all the restaurants. And then we can do restaurants.each do restaurant. And in here, we'll do a div, and we'll do restaurant.name. Okay, so that's our restaurant. Now we need the ability to create new restaurants. So we'll do form for restaurant, restaurant.new. And in here, we'll want a text field for the name. And we will want a submit button. So save that, we'll refresh. Now we see our one restaurant and we see our form. So we'll type in here, click create, and it says the action create could not be found. And that's because we haven't implemented it. So let's go implement create. Create looks like this. It's going to get a name, which is params of restaurant of name. It's going to create the restaurant like this, and then it's going to redirect back to the restaurant's index view. So if we use this now, we can see that it works. Okay. Now imagine I wanted to be able to link into each of the restaurants. We can do that too. We're just going to go into our index view. And we're going to change this from just showing the name to being a link to restaurant.name and restaurant path of restaurant. So we refresh. Now these are linked. If I click them, they say the action show cannot be found. And that's fine. We just have to go implement the show action. So let's do it. We have the restaurant ID, which we know is params of ID. And then we have the ability to get a restaurant is restaurant.where ID is restaurant ID dot first. And then we want to render, so we're not going to write anything after that, but it does mean that we have to create a show endpoint. And this will say something like h2 restaurant.name. And we will also include our link to all restaurants. So we do that, we refresh. Now we've got a show page for the restaurant. Now imagine inside of restaurants, I think it was ratings that we wanted to be able to create. Now imagine we wanted to create a form for a rating. So we did ratings.new, do F. And this is the same thing we did before. I think it was something like, I don't remember what ratings has on it. Let's see. Oh, sorry, review. Remember we had review. So I'm going to use review here. And we want to be able to do this. So we create a form. We say f.text field comment. Okay. The problem with this is that we're creating a form for just a review. It has a comment field and it has a submit. But when you actually go to submit that review, how is Rails going to know what restaurant to put the review onto? the reason that it can't know that is because there's nothing about review here that tells it. And I can prove that to you. So let's go into our routes file and we're going to do resources reviews. So now if I go here, our form is going to render, and let's inspect it and look at the path. Look, it just says /reviews. So there's no way when I actually go submit this review for us to know what restaurant the review was about. So we need to somehow be able to pass the restaurant ID through. Now, there are ways we can do that. So one way we can do that is I can go into the show endpoint and I can do f.text field restaurant ID. And I can say the value is the restaurant ID. So if I do that, I could put a little form here that had the ID in it. And then when you click create review, we would be able to pick up that ID on the other side. That's fine. That's an okay way to do it. But not a lot of websites have you do something like this. So, and normally the way that they make you think about it instead is they want to be able to, like if you go to any website, you go to GitHub or something, you're actually, when you go to your repository, you're going to /allaboard bootcamp and then / the name of your repository. So we want to be able to create reviews that live inside of restaurants. Maybe even, let's take the form away for a second, just to talk about this without the form. Imagine here that I had some details about the restaurant. So I said details about the restaurant. And then I wanted to create a link to reviews of this restaurant. What would I write right here? I think this really gets to the point. It's like, what would I write? I would have to write, I don't know what I would write, because I can't, if I wrote reviews like this, that's going to work. But look at the URL. It's just /reviews. There's nothing in here about which restaurant these reviews are for. And it's because of that that we need nested routes. So what nested resources. What nested resources let us do is they let us change this so that instead of it being reviews path, it is restaurant reviews path and takes in the restaurant. If I do that and I take the routes and I nest them like this, watch what happens to the URL. Same URL. Look, now it's /restaurants/2/reviews. So by making the nested route and changing how I construct the URL, I've actually taken the ID of the restaurant and I've placed it inside that URL. So now when I click this, I can go define a reviews controller that knows what restaurant it's getting the reviews for. And just to complete the loop completely, I'm going to do that for you so that we can all see it. So I'm going to Rails G controller reviews. So this hopefully makes it really clear for people, again, why we need a reviews controller. We'll get that reviews controller here. Now, if I refresh the page again, it's going to say the action index can't be found. So let's add our action index. And look at the, if I refresh now and I'm looking at this and I roll down, you're going to actually see that I'm going to write, you don't have to know what I'm doing here, but I'm showing the params. Now look at what the params look like. The params have a restaurant ID field inside of them. So that's what Rails has done for you, is it's actually taken this ID that's now sitting inside of the URL and it's put it inside of the params. So now we can get it by just doing restaurant ID equals params of restaurant ID. And then what we do here is we say @reviews equals, at restaurant equals restaurant, where the ID is the restaurant ID dot first. And then the reviews is just equal to restaurant dot reviews. Then we can go to our reviews folder. We can go new, we can go index.html.erb. And then here we can say h2 reviews for restaurant name. And here we can do /h2 reviews.each do review. And here we'll have that div, and then we'll have the review.comment. Okay, so now I'm going to use it. I'm going to go here. These are all the reviews for John. So if I go back and I go back again, now these are all my restaurants. Okay, now I'm going to go into my Rails console just to prove that everything's working. I'll go to my Rails console. I'll go to the last restaurant. I'll go to the last restaurant, which we'll call R, and I'll do r.reviews.create comment disgusting. Okay, and now what we should be able to see is if I click into Al's and I go look at the reviews, that's the other, well, let's write something that we haven't written before. So instead of disgusting, I'll just write woo. So if I go look at Al's and I click reviews, there is no woo. If I go back and I click John, I click reviews, no woo. And if I click queer reviews, now woo. So hopefully this this longer explanation has shown everyone kind of what the nested resource is, why you want them, and how they work. Okay, so the homework for this exercise. Exercise 1, you're going to create a model that represents a music album. Albums have a name and an artist name. Then you're going to create a model that represents a music song. Songs have a name, but they also belong to an album. So this is stuff that we've done before. Exercise 2, and I want you to be sure to use resources here. You're going to create an index page that lists the albums and links to individual album pages. So each of the album pages will show all of the songs on a given album. And then I want you to include a link on the individual album pages that gets you back to that album index page. And then 3, I want you to create a form that allows adding a new album via that index page. So that's using form 4. And then the big kahuna is this one, which is create another form that allows adding a song to an album. And for that one, you probably will want to use nested routes. And then the last note is that each of the forms should redirect back to the page that it was created from after creation. It's a lot. Let me turn the light on. Any questions about anything, please drop them. Okay. I mean, look at all the things that this homework is piecing together. You're piecing together Rails models with your knowledge of Ruby. You're creating forms. You're receiving the forms. You're doing redirects. You're using controllers, views. I mean, for some people in the class that have started programming, potentially started programming in earnest 10 or 11 days ago, this is a long way that you've come. Even people that haven't seen Ruby or Rails before that have gotten to here, it's wow. Someone asked, Ernest asked, how many of us have come to class today? I think there were 82 people earlier. So I think we actually have more people today than yesterday. No, it's you, Tara. So like if you got this far, it's because you've done the work. For every person that is here, there's 1.5 people that have decided to leave the course. So not to say that I'm sure that they did that for good reasons, but you're here because you're dedicated to doing this, and I appreciate you being here. So hopefully you can do this exercise, and if not, don't worry too much about it. We are going to cover it tomorrow. We're going to do it again. We're going to cover tomorrow. We're going to spend a little bit of time on a couple straggling Rails concepts, and then we're going to be done talking about Rails exclusively, and we're going to move on to other pieces that interact with Rails. So after tomorrow, we're going to move on to some more HTML and CSS. And then I know that we planned on covering 3 days of JavaScript. I might not actually spend 3 days on JavaScript. I think I talked about that yesterday. So I might spend a little bit less time and maybe spend more time on making like a real experience with Rails and CSS. Oloason asks, can we take a look at using resources with other fields apart from ID? What you should look at there is you should look at toParam, TO_param. I can't cover it here just because I think I'll lose too many people if I do that. But once you create toParam, they work just like regular resources. So it's still the field will still be called ID, but they're just regular resources. So the way that I'll give you like a sneak peek. The way that they work is if you go into restaurants, the model. That's not the model. App, models, restaurant. And you define a toParam method here. You can return something from this, like name. And watch what happens when I do that. If I go to /restaurants, everything still works the same way, but now when I right click on these, it's /restaurant/John. Okay, so that's the direction you want to look in if you want to get that working. It's very simple to do. It's just I don't want to go too far into it because I think it's just going to confuse people. Thank you, Sul. I appreciate that. I appreciate all of you as well. Regex says, I have to ask something regarding this form thing. I mean, the one I used, would it be possible for you to go through it once and see how it works when you're free? Yeah, if you want to just send me the details, I'll be happy to help you with that. Felipe says, the panelist was awesome. Thanks you. Yeah, I think the panelist is great too. I'm really glad you liked it. I wish that we could have just had Eddie sit here for like the entire time. It seemed like he was ready to too. So if we're interested, we can definitely have him back. Oloason says that I almost missed the class today because I took a 30-minute nap to the class. Yulia, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, says, can we implement search form on the page? How can we implement a search form on the page? Yeah, so search is really not much different from other forms. If you have a form, right now you're sending a form and then you're doing a create with it. But all a search form is instead of calling create, you just use something like where, and then you render those records the same way that you would any other way. So if you wanted to, for example, search the restaurants here, we could just add, we could add another form. And then when we receive that form, we could have it go to, instead of going there, we could go to a search URL. And then on that page, instead of showing all of the restaurants, we just show the ones that match the name. And if you're interested in more details on that, you could look at like queries. I'm not going to cover them, but that maybe will point you in the right direction. Also, real search, like Google type search, uses a search engine, which is like a separate piece of software that sits next to the website. So you can look at something like Elasticsearch, which if you're interested in that too. Anonymous attendee says, is the final project going to be difficult? I mean, I think so. I don't think it's going to be too difficult. I don't, obviously, I want to make sure that the final project, for the most part, uses the things that I've taught in the class. I will probably be finding a way to make the final project not include only things that I taught in the class, because I do think that an important part of engineering, and especially when you're first getting started in engineering, is being able to think of something that you want and be able to find that thing and find how that thing works. So for the most part, the whole premise of the course really is that I want to prepare you with the core concepts that you need to be able to go find the other things that you need to piece together a solution. So I don't think it's possible with like no foundation. Like imagine you just sat down one day and you were like, I want to make a blogging website. You can't go from just like sitting down thinking you want to make a blogging website to making one. But with the foundation that we've built in the class, you actually could do that. So the point of the class is to teach the foundation, not necessarily to teach you all the things. So the final project is going to reflect that in being a project that uses the foundation we've taught, but then pushes you in maybe some new directions. And it will not be group-based. It's going to be individual-based. Oliver Basin says, are we on the engineering path or the web developer path? And what's the difference? I don't see much of a difference there. I think if I had to pick one of those, I would probably say the engineering path, because when I think about web developer, meaning like pure web developer, I think about someone who's just working in HTML and CSS. So I think it depends on your definition of those two things. But if you are writing code, especially code in like in a real language, like not just HTML, which is a declarative language, like with these tags and stuff, if you're writing real code that has logic and things like that, then I would frown at anyone that did not say that that is engineering, because that's what software engineering is. Okay. I will see y'all tomorrow. Thank you again for your time, and see you soon.